Good morning, Professor Heinrich Bohlmann. Just for the sake of our listener, first of all, I just want to thank you for accepting our invitation for this today's podcast, powered by ABiQ. You are associate professor at the University of Pretoria. You are also the president of the Economic Society of South Africa, and also a research director at the Partnership for Economic Policy. Thank you once more. I'll just straight away go into our discussion of today on the outlook for the South African construction industry after the COVID-19. My first question to you, Professor, will be, what's the impact of COVID-19 on the construction sector in South Africa?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, look, I mean, COVID was, of course, terrible for pretty much all industries. You know, there was always, of course, the one or two winners that came out of it, but you know, construction was especially hard hit. So 2020 was a terrible year. 2021 was a terrible year. And 2022, we kind of were looking forward to a good, strong recovery. But of course, we've had a series of additional negative shocks striking not just the South African economy, but the global economy, with obviously the war in Ukraine being a big part of this, rising inflation. You know, it just in general, a fairly negative and depressing outlook in the short to medium term, which is, it's kind of going to negate the recovery in the sector we were hoping for. And of course, it then goes beyond just the construction industry itself. It's all those industries that are tied to it that will obviously face some consequences as well. But yeah, look, in short, COVID was bad news for it, but perhaps even worse is this kind of prolonged negative outlook and uncertainty in the economies globally, really.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I wanted to ask another question on the outlook for 2023 on the construction industry in South Africa. I understand that this question is a bit kind of difficult to answer because of the uncertainty, you know, around it, especially with the stagflation, the risk of stagflation now that has increased, you know, because of some of the things that you have mentioned, like the war in Ukraine and its effect on food prices, you know, and also COVID-19 adverse effect on the economy, the global economy. What is your view on the outlook for 2023 on the construction industry sector?
Yeah, so the important thing to realize is that any outlook of the construction sector as a whole is very closely linked to what the outlook is for investment, or more formally, gross fixed capital formation in economies. And that outlook is fairly poor. And that's, you know, we're coming from a fairly, you know, the outlook in terms of business confidence, the uncertainties, these things are, you know, there's no kind of light at the end of the tunnel in terms of when these issues will be resolved. You know, and added to that is the fact that in South Africa, at least, the government makes up a considerable share of what happens in terms of investment and therefore construction. And the outlook for government spending is for that to decline. You know, we know there's lots of fiscal pressures, etc. And so that would kind of put a further brake on perhaps some investments and infrastructure spending that could have happened otherwise. So, I mean, yeah, look, it's not at this stage, unless a lot of good news happens, the sector is hardly going to grow beyond that of GDP. So it's slightly above is the current projections, around, say, 3% for investment, and construction can benefit from that. But, you know, the medium-term outlook going through to 2024 even doesn't get us back to pre-COVID levels. To give you an idea of how much more growth is needed for the sector. So the very moderate growth we're seeing and expecting, that is subject, of course, to more bad news, which is at this stage, unfortunately, more likely than good news the way we're going. So a moderate recovery is in our forecast, but again, not fast enough or big enough to really undo most of the damage that happened during the COVID period.
You mentioned something very important, and it's true actually, that in South Africans, government spending support the industry recovery, not only the construction industry, but also the economy as a whole. My question is, what can be done, in your view, to put the private sector at the center, or to get the private sector more involved? We know that the private sector need to be involved.
Look, absolutely. There's been hints from a South African perspective that government is starting to really understand that their job should be that of facilitating new jobs and investment instead of trying to spearhead it at all times, because they end up crowding out a lot of what the private sector could and should be doing. But really, the key word for the private sector when it comes to investment, which is of course desperately needed, is certainty, right? And unfortunately, our government kind of shoots itself in the foot, and this is true, I guess, for many economies in the continent. We're just not doing enough to get a clear, certain picture of the direction we're willing to go and the support we are willing to give to the private sector to do the necessary investments. So really, just take the energy sector in South Africa is a good example. That's a sector which could produce a lot of investment spending and a lot of construction work. And I should add that construction work is, of course, quite a labor-intensive process in general. So it can do a lot, of course, to help alleviate our unemployment problems. But the construction sector will continue to suffer unless that kind of policy certainty is provided by government. And like I said, with the example of energy, that's an area where South Africa continually fails to provide policy certainty, right? And the various regulatory environments that would facilitate investment. So whilst government spending is important, right, and it should of course continue within limits, as you said, we really need the private sector to come to the party, but they need policy certainty. They need returns on investment. And the only way they can plan long-term for good investments is if there's an element of certainty in the medium-term forecast. And the latest numbers in South Africa, for example, is again business sector confidence is at its lowest levels in nearly 30 years. So I mean, none of this suggests that the private sector has a lot of confidence in terms of policy certainty and all these things which are really important in driving private sector investment. We're just coming out of a decade of state capture, where key institutions were eroded. Rule of law is still a big problem in the sector. So apart from all the other regulatory issues, so the solutions are, I think, pretty clear. There's no mystery to what needs to be done to solve these problems to get the private sector involved. It's a matter of political will, etc., to get it done. Right.
Thank you, Professor. My last question to you. You mentioned earlier on about energy. I thought of renewable energy too, or broadly speaking, I thought about the green building. Do you think green building can be a way forward to help drive growth in the sector? Beside upgrading infrastructure to ease traffic, for example, because I know in South Africa there's a lot of infrastructure upgrades to kind of ease traffic, but my specific question concerns green building. Do you think it's a way forward to help drive growth within the construction sector in South Africa?
Yeah, look, a green focus isn't necessarily going to improve the overall investment outlook and construction sector. It would obviously create shifts within that in terms of what are the types of materials that will be used, etc. And again, that has more of an environmental impact, which is the goal of these type of regulations and the green push we see globally. But it will just be kind of replacing one form of construction with another. What we really need is more, lifting the level, and that's not going to happen until those issues we've just discussed in the previous point happens, where we sharpen up our institutions and bring back confidence, etc. The green emphasis, like I say, it will create slightly new winners and losers as far as what the required materials, etc., are. But that's not going to kind of save the sector overall. The overall need and demand for construction spending and investment is still kind of tied to those big macro and institutional issues mentioned before.
Thank you so much, Professor. We came to an end of today's podcast. I just want to say thank you so much for your time and for accepting an invitation. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Pleasure. Goodbye.